I came home at noon to check on my sick wife, and before I reached the front door, I heard a single sentence that made 41 years of marriage feel like a carefully rehearsed illusion. I stood frozen on the front porch with my hand resting on the brass doorknob I had polished every spring since we bought the house. The October breeze carried the scent of maple leaves across our quiet Ohio neighborhood, but I barely noticed it anymore. My name is Daniel Carter. I am 67 years old, retired after nearly 4 decades as an electrical engineer, and until that afternoon, I believed I knew exactly what my life looked like. My wife, Margaret, had been battling what doctors described as a complicated autoimmune illness for almost a year. Every morning I prepared her breakfast, organized her medications in a plastic container labeled with the days of the week, and drove to volunteer 3 mornings a week at the local community center before returning home during lunch to make sure she had everything she needed. It had become our routine, one I followed without complaint because loving someone often means accepting routines you never imagined. That Tuesday looked no different from any other. I stopped at the neighborhood deli and bought Margaret her favorite chicken noodle soup along with a fresh loaf of sourdough bread, because she had mentioned the night before that nothing else sounded appetizing. I even picked up a small bouquet of white daisies from the grocery store. They were never expensive, but she always smiled when she saw fresh flowers on the kitchen table. I remember thinking how lucky I was that even after all these years I could still find little ways to brighten her day. As I stepped onto the porch, I realized her bedroom window was slightly open. At first I thought nothing of it. Then I heard her voice. It was stronger than it had sounded in months, steady and almost cheerful. I paused without meaning to listen. She laughed softly before saying, "Don't worry. Daniel still believes every word I've told him." My heartbeat slowed instead of racing, as if my body refused to understand what my ears had just heard. Another voice answered through the speakerphone, too faint for me to recognize, but Margaret replied almost immediately. "As long as he keeps following the routine, everything stays exactly as planned." Planned. That single word settled over me like an unexpected winter frost. I looked down at the paper bag holding the soup that was beginning to cool in my hands. For several long seconds I convinced myself there had to be an innocent explanation. Maybe they were talking about a surprise anniversary dinner. Maybe it involved medical treatment she wanted to keep secret until she had better news. My mind searched desperately for ordinary answers because ordinary answers were easier than questioning the woman I had loved since we met during our sophomore year at Ohio State. Then she spoke again. "He feels guilty enough already. That's why he never asks questions." Those words landed differently. They carried no warmth, no affection, only quiet certainty. I remained perfectly still, afraid even my breathing would betray my presence. Every memory from the past year began replaying itself in my mind. The canceled vacations. The growing stack of medical bills I had never examined closely because I trusted her completely. The afternoons when she insisted she was too exhausted for visitors. The evenings when she encouraged me to spend time with old friends while she stayed home to rest. Each memory drifted back with a slightly different shape than before, as though someone had adjusted the lighting inside a familiar room. I wanted to push open the door and ask the simplest question in the world. "Margaret, what are you talking about?" Instead, I quietly stepped backward off the porch without making a sound. The flowers remained in the paper sleeve. The soup was still warm enough to eat. Yet for the first time in my life, I wasn't bringing comfort home. I was walking away carrying something much heavier than groceries. I was carrying the first piece of a truth I had never imagined I would have to uncover. I sat in my truck at the end of our street for nearly 20 minutes, staring through the windshield without seeing anything in front of me. Children rode their bicycles along the sidewalk, a mail carrier walked from one house to another, and somewhere nearby a lawn mower hummed steadily through the mild autumn afternoon. Life continued exactly as it always had, yet nothing inside me felt familiar anymore. I looked down at the paper bag resting on the passenger seat. The soup was probably cold by then, and the daisies had already begun to droop. They suddenly seemed like gifts meant for someone I no longer recognized. My first instinct was to confront Margaret immediately, to ask her who she had been speaking to and what she meant by saying everything was planned. But after more than 4 decades of marriage, I understood something that my younger self never would have. People rarely reveal the truth when they know they have been caught. If I wanted answers, I would have to pretend I had heard nothing at all. I drove around the neighborhood once before returning home 5 minutes later than usual. This time I opened the front door with enough noise for her to hear me coming. "Honey, I am home," I called in the same cheerful voice I had used thousands of times before. A few seconds later, Margaret appeared at the end of the hallway wearing her pale blue cardigan, the one she always wore when she wanted to look especially fragile. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, and she offered me the tired smile that had become so familiar over the past year. "You are back early," she said softly. "I thought you had another meeting today." "It finished sooner than expected," I replied as naturally as I could. I held up the flowers with a smile. "I brought you something." She looked genuinely pleased when she accepted the daisies. "Daniel, you always know how to make me smile." Those words would have warmed my heart only an hour earlier. Now I found myself studying every expression on her face, wondering which parts were real and which parts had been carefully practiced. She kissed my cheek lightly before placing the flowers in a glass vase beside the kitchen sink. I noticed that her movements were smooth and confident. There was no hesitation, no stiffness, none of the exhaustion she often displayed when she believed I was watching closely. Then, almost as if remembering a role she needed to play, she slowed down and rested one hand against the countertop. "I am feeling a little weak again," she said with a quiet sigh. "Some days are harder than others." I nodded sympathetically while forcing myself not to react. "I brought your favorite soup." "That sounds perfect," she answered. We sat together at the kitchen table while she slowly ate lunch. She thanked me twice for thinking of her and even reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Anyone watching us would have seen an ordinary married couple sharing a peaceful afternoon. Only I knew that every smile now carried a question I could not answer. As she finished eating, her cellular phone vibrated on the counter. She glanced at the screen for only a fraction of a second before turning it face down. "Just another spam call," she said casually. Margaret had never been the type to hide her phone. In fact, for years we had shared passwords to everything without giving it a second thought. Now that simple movement felt strangely deliberate. After lunch, she insisted on lying down for a nap. She thanked me again for taking such good care of her, then disappeared into the bedroom and quietly closed the door. I remained at the kitchen table long after she had gone. The house was completely silent except for the ticking wall clock above the refrigerator. I slowly looked around the room that had once represented comfort and stability. Family photographs lined the shelves. Vacation magnets decorated the refrigerator. Our wedding picture still hung near the dining room entrance, showing two young people smiling with complete confidence in the future ahead of them. I wanted to believe that picture still represented us. Instead, I found myself wondering when the distance had truly begun. Had it started a year ago when she became ill, or had it been growing quietly for much longer while I was too busy trusting the life we had built together? I realized then that if I wanted the truth, I would have to stop looking at my marriage through memories and start looking at it through evidence. I barely slept that night. Margaret rested beside me with the calm breathing of someone who appeared, completely at peace, while I lay awake staring into the darkness, listening to every sound our old house made. The furnace clicked on just after midnight. A branch brushed against the bedroom window whenever the wind picked up. The digital clock beside the bed changed from 1 minute to the next with quiet precision, reminding me how slowly time could move when certainty disappeared. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I found myself replaying the past year in a way I never had before. At the time, every change in our lives had seemed reasonable. Looking back now, each memory carried a different weight. Margaret had always insisted on managing our household paperwork. She paid the utility bills, organized our insurance documents, and kept every receipt neatly filed in labeled folders inside the home office. I had always joked that she was the better organizer while I handled repairs around the house, lawn care, and investment planning. We trusted each other completely, so dividing responsibilities had never seemed unusual. Then, almost a year earlier, shortly after her diagnosis, she gently suggested that she should also handle our retirement accounts because dealing with paperwork gave her something to focus on during treatment. I agreed without hesitation because I believed helping her feel useful might lift her spirits. I remembered another afternoon several months later when she apologized for missing our granddaughter Lily's piano recital. She claimed she was too exhausted to leave the house, so I attended alone. When I returned, I found the dishwasher already unloaded, fresh laundry folded perfectly in the bedroom, and several flower beds outside freshly watered. At the time, I admired her determination despite feeling unwell. Now I wondered how someone who could barely walk through a grocery store had managed hours of housework without mentioning it. There were other moments I had quietly dismissed. She had begun taking phone calls in the guest bedroom instead of the living room, explaining that she did not want to interrupt my television programs. She started deleting text message notifications immediately after reading them, saying endless advertisements cluttered her phone. Even our son Nathan commented once that his mother sounded much stronger during their private conversations than she did whenever I entered the room. We both laughed about it then. Margaret smiled and said mothers always found extra energy when talking to their children. I accepted the explanation because it came from the woman I trusted most. The following morning, I made breakfast as usual. Margaret thanked me for the scrambled eggs and whole wheat toast before reminding me that she had a virtual appointment with one of her specialists later that afternoon. She even rolled her eyes with gentle frustration and said she was tired of doctors asking the same questions every month. I smiled politely, but inside I noticed something new. She never mentioned the doctor's name anymore. Earlier in her treatment, she had spoken often about appointments, medications, and test results. Recently, those conversations had become strangely vague, almost rehearsed. After breakfast, I kissed her forehead and told her I would spend a few hours at the community center. Instead, I drove across town and parked outside our local bank. I had no clear plan. I only knew that before I questioned anyone else, I needed to understand the facts of my own life. Trust had guided every decision I had made for more than 40 years. If trust had been misplaced, then evidence would have to become my new guide. As I walked toward the entrance, I felt no anger, only a quiet sadness that settled deeper with every step. Somewhere between the automatic glass doors and the customer service desk, I realized I was no longer trying to prove Margaret innocent. I was trying to discover how much of my life had been built on truths, and how much had depended on stories I had accepted simply because they came from the person I loved most. The young woman at the customer service desk greeted me with the same warm smile I had seen for years. She recognized me immediately because Margaret and I had been customers of that bank since the day we bought our first home. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said. "How can we help you today?" I returned the smile, careful not to reveal the uncertainty growing inside me. "I would like to review a few of our account records. I realized it has been a while since I looked through everything myself." She nodded politely and asked me to wait while a personal banker became available. A few minutes later, I found myself sitting across from a gentleman named Kevin, who patiently pulled up our account information on his computer. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Our checking account still received my monthly pension deposits. Household expenses were paid on time. Utility bills looked exactly as I expected. Then Kevin asked an innocent question that caught me off guard. "Would you also like copies of the transfers connected to your secondary account?" I frowned slightly. "Secondary account?" He turned the monitor toward me. "Yes, sir. The joint savings account that has been making regular electronic transfers over the past 10 months. I stared at the screen without speaking. I recognized the account number immediately because it belonged to us, yet I had no memory of opening a separate savings account dedicated to monthly transfers. Kevin noticed my hesitation and politely explained that both account holders had full authorization. He assumed I simply wanted older records. I quietly asked him to print every statement available. He handed me a neat stack of papers before wishing me a pleasant afternoon. I thanked him and walked back to my truck without opening a single page. Somehow I already knew those papers would change something inside me forever. I drove to a small public park a few miles away, the same park where Margaret and I had often shared sandwiches after church on warm Sunday afternoons. I parked beneath a large oak tree, rolled down the windows, and finally began reading. The transfers were not enormous, but they were consistent. Every month, several $1,000s had quietly moved from our retirement savings into another account. The destination account number meant nothing to me. More surprising was the authorization history. Nearly every transfer had been approved electronically from Margaret's online banking profile. My profile had not been used once. I searched my memory, trying to remember giving permission for those transactions, but nothing came back. I had trusted her completely whenever she told me another bill needed to be paid or another financial adjustment had become necessary because of medical expenses. My hands remained steady as I turned each page, but inside I felt as though another small piece of certainty had disappeared. I decided not to jump to conclusions. There could still be an explanation. Perhaps she had opened a separate account for treatment costs. Perhaps our financial advisor had recommended organizing expenses differently. I refused to accuse her without understanding the full picture. Before leaving the park, I called our longtime financial advisor, Richard Benson, and asked whether he might have time for a brief meeting later that week. His voice sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me. "Of course, Daniel. It has been a while. Is everything all right?" I looked down at the stack of statements resting on the passenger seat. "I'm not sure anymore," I answered honestly. "I just have a few questions about our accounts." Richard agreed to meet me the following morning. As I ended the call, I realized this was the first conversation I had kept entirely from Margaret in more than 40 years. That realization hurt more than any bank statement. Keeping secrets had never been part of our marriage. Yet now silence seemed to be the only path leading toward the truth. I folded the documents carefully, placed them inside a plain envelope, and locked them in the glove compartment before driving home. When I walked through the front door that evening, Margaret greeted me with the same gentle smile she had worn every day for months. I smiled back just as warmly. But for the first time in our marriage, I understood that two people could stand only a few feet apart while living in completely different versions of the same life. The next morning, I arrived at Richard Benson's office 10 minutes early, something I had always considered a sign of respect. His office overlooked the town square where we had attended holiday parades with our family for years. Familiar places usually brought comfort. That morning they only reminded me how easily ordinary life could hide extraordinary secrets. Richard greeted me with a firm handshake and genuine warmth. We had worked together for nearly 20 years, and he knew almost every major financial decision Margaret and I had ever made. After a few minutes of casual conversation, I placed the envelope containing the bank statements on his desk. "Richard," I said quietly, "I need you to explain something because I believe I have missed an important part of my own life." His friendly expression slowly became more serious as he reviewed the documents one page at a time. He adjusted his reading glasses, paused twice, then looked back at me with an expression I could not immediately read. "Daniel," he asked carefully, "are you telling me these transfers surprise you?" I nodded. "I have never authorized them knowingly." He remained silent for several seconds before opening another file from his cabinet. "There is something I assumed both you and Margaret had already discussed." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of several financial planning forms bearing both our names. My signature appeared on every page. At first glance they looked authentic, but something felt strangely wrong. I studied one document more closely and realized the signature resembled mine without actually being mine. The shape of the letters was almost perfect, yet the small habits developed over decades of signing legal documents were missing. Richard noticed me comparing the signatures. "You seem uncertain," he said gently. I took a slow breath. "Because I did not sign these." The room became very quiet. Richard leaned back in his chair without saying anything for several moments. Finally, he folded his hands together. "If that is true, Daniel, then we have a much larger issue than unexpected transfers." I felt surprisingly calm. The anger I had expected never arrived. Instead, I felt the quiet determination of someone assembling pieces of a complicated puzzle. "Tell me everything," I said. Richard explained that over the previous year Margaret had attended several meetings alone, always saying I preferred staying home or volunteering. She described me as increasingly overwhelmed by retirement paperwork and insisted she was simply helping manage our finances. Nothing she requested had seemed unreasonable because every document appeared properly completed. Richard had no reason to suspect otherwise. As he spoke, another memory surfaced. About 11 months earlier, Margaret had asked me to sign several insurance forms after dinner. I remembered being distracted by a football game playing softly in the background while she pointed to different places with a pen. I had trusted her completely and barely glanced at the paperwork before signing where she indicated. Had those pages later been replaced? Had my signature been copied from another document? I could no longer tell. Richard apologized repeatedly, although none of this had been his fault. Before I left, he handed me certified copies of every document connected to the transfers and suggested I meet with an attorney before making any decisions. I thanked him sincerely. As I walked back toward my truck, my cellular phone rang. The screen displayed Nathan's name. My son sounded unusually cheerful. Dad, Emily and I were thinking about stopping by this weekend. Mom said she has been feeling a little better lately. I paused for only a moment before answering. That sounds nice. We have not all had dinner together in a while. Nathan laughed softly. Mom will be happy to hear that. After we ended the call, I remained standing beside my truck with the phone still in my hand. Something about the conversation lingered in my thoughts. Nathan had mentioned Margaret feeling better before I had said a single word about her condition. He sounded confident, almost certain, as though he knew details I had not shared. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had been unwilling to face. What if Margaret had not been carrying this secret alone? What if someone else inside my own family already knew far more than I did? That question followed me all the way home, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, I understood that discovering the truth about my wife might only be the beginning of what I was about to uncover. That evening I followed the same routine I had followed for years because routines have a way of making people feel safe. Margaret settled into her favorite chair with a blanket over her lap while I prepared dinner. We talked about the weather, a new bakery opening downtown, and whether the maple tree in the backyard would need trimming before winter. If someone had walked past our dining room window, they would have seen nothing more than an ordinary retired couple enjoying a quiet evening together. Yet every sentence now carried a second meaning because I had begun listening not only to what Margaret said, but also to what she carefully avoided saying. After dinner, she excused herself, claiming she felt tired after a long day. About 15 minutes later, I heard the familiar vibration of her cellular phone from the hallway. Instead of answering in the living room, she quietly walked into the guest bedroom and closed the door. I remained seated at the kitchen table with an unfinished cup of coffee, pretending to read the newspaper while counting the minutes. Nearly half an hour passed before she returned. Her expression was calm, almost relieved. "Everything all right?" I asked with the same gentle concern I had always shown. She smiled warmly. "Just talking with Nathan. He wanted to check on me." I nodded without questioning her, but the answer stayed with me. Nathan had called me only a few hours earlier. During that conversation, he never mentioned planning another call with his mother that evening. It was a small inconsistency, yet I had learned over the past 2 days that small inconsistencies often pointed toward much larger truths. The following afternoon, Margaret told me she had another virtual appointment with her specialist and asked whether I would mind spending a few hours visiting my friend Harold across town. She said she always felt uncomfortable discussing medical details while I was nearby because she did not want me worrying even more than I already did. A week earlier, I would have accepted her explanation without hesitation. Instead, I smiled and agreed. I even drove several miles away before quietly returning home through the alley behind our property, where the detached garage blocked the view from the front windows. I entered the garage as silently as possible and remained there for several minutes. Through the small side window, I could see part of the kitchen and hear faint voices drifting through the open window above the sink. Margaret was not speaking with a doctor. Her tone was relaxed, confident, and occasionally interrupted by laughter. Then I heard another familiar voice. It belonged to Emily, my daughter-in-law. I could not hear every sentence clearly, but several phrases reached me without difficulty. "He still has not noticed." A few moments later, Emily replied, "Good. We only need a little more time." My hands tightened around the edge of the workbench beside me, not because of anger, but because another piece of the puzzle had quietly fallen into place. Margaret answered, "Richard almost asked too many questions last month, but everything worked out." My thoughts immediately returned to the meeting with our financial advisor. They knew he had become curious. They had discussed him before I ever walked into his office. The conversation continued for several more minutes, but the voices became too soft to distinguish. Eventually, I heard footsteps moving through the house. Not wanting to risk being discovered, I slipped back through the garage door, started my truck, and drove away as though I had been gone all afternoon. By the time I returned an hour later, Margaret was resting comfortably on the sofa with a television program playing quietly in the background. She looked up and smiled. "Did you enjoy visiting Harold?" she asked. I smiled just as naturally. We had a good afternoon catching up. Neither of us mentioned anything else. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, I unlocked the small fireproof box where we kept important family documents. Birth certificates, insurance policies, property records, and old tax returns were all exactly where I expected them to be. One folder, however, was missing. It contained the original paperwork for our retirement trust, a folder Margaret herself had insisted should never leave the house. I closed the box slowly and sat alone in the darkness of my study. I no longer wondered whether there was a secret inside my family. I knew there was. The only question that remained was how many people had been protecting it while looking me in the eye every single day. I spent the next 2 days doing something I never imagined I would do inside my own marriage. I stopped making assumptions and started collecting facts. Every morning, I followed the same routine that Margaret expected. I prepared breakfast, reminded her to take her medication, kissed her goodbye before leaving the house, and smiled whenever she thanked me for taking such good care of her. Nothing about my behavior changed because I had learned that people reveal far more when they believe nothing has changed around them. Meanwhile, I quietly arranged meetings that no one else knew about. The first was with an attorney named Michael Brooks, a man Richard Benson had recommended because of his experience with estate planning and financial disputes. Michael listened patiently while I described everything from the conversation I overheard to the unexplained bank transfers and the missing trust documents. He never interrupted me. When I finished, he folded his hands and said something that stayed with me. "Daniel, emotions can cloud judgment, but documents usually tell a very honest story." Over the next hour, he carefully reviewed every statement, every signature, and every record I had collected. He pointed out dates I had overlooked. Several financial changes had happened on days when Margaret claimed she had been too ill to leave the house. Other documents had been submitted electronically from our home during hours when I was volunteering at the community center. Michael advised me not to accuse anyone yet. Instead, he suggested securing my personal assets and preserving every record exactly as it appeared. That afternoon, I opened a new individual account where future pension deposits could be redirected. I updated online security information, changed passwords connected to my personal financial records, and requested alerts for any activity involving our remaining joint accounts. None of those actions affected Margaret immediately, and that was intentional. I was not trying to trap her. I was making sure no additional surprises could quietly unfold while I searched for the truth. Before leaving Michael's office, I also signed paperwork creating certified copies of my current estate documents. If any future changes appeared, there would be a clear record showing exactly when they occurred. As I drove home, I realized how strange my life had become. Only a week earlier, I had believed retirement would be filled with gardening, weekend visits from Nathan and Emily, and quiet evenings beside the woman I loved. Now I measured my days by bank records, legal documents, and conversations spoken behind closed doors. When I arrived home, Margaret greeted me with unexpected excitement. "Nathan and Emily are coming over Sunday," she said. "I thought we could have a nice family dinner." Her voice sounded warm and hopeful, almost eager. I smiled without hesitation. "That sounds like a wonderful idea. It has been too long since we all sat down together." She looked relieved by my answer. "I knew you would say that." As she turned toward the kitchen, I noticed something I had missed before. Her shoulders were straight, her steps confident, and her movements effortless until she realized I was still watching. Then, almost automatically, she slowed her pace and lightly touched the back of a chair as though steadying herself. The change lasted only a second, but once seen, it could not be unseen. That evening, Nathan called again to confirm dinner plans. He sounded relaxed, asking whether I wanted him to bring dessert. We chatted about football, his work, and Lily's upcoming school concert. It was the kind of conversation fathers and sons have every day across America. Yet beneath every ordinary sentence, I found myself wondering whether he knew the truth, or whether he too had become someone else's unwitting participant. I wanted desperately to believe my son was innocent. I wanted to believe Emily had acted alone or that Margaret had hidden everything from him. But hope is not evidence, and I had promised myself that I would never again confuse the two. Late that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I opened the folder Michael had prepared for me. On the front page, he had written a single sentence in neat blue ink. "Let the facts speak before the emotions do." I closed the folder and looked toward the hallway leading to our bedroom. In just a few days, my family would gather around the same dining table where we had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and Thanksgiving dinners for decades. They believed it would be another ordinary meal. Only I knew that by the time dessert was served, the truth I had been quietly collecting would finally have nowhere left to hide. Sunday arrived with clear blue skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that usually made family gatherings feel special. I spent the morning preparing grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes, and Margaret's favorite apple pie. She complimented the smell coming from the kitchen and thanked me several times for putting so much effort into the meal. Watching her smile so naturally made me wonder whether she believed every chapter of this story had already been written. Shortly after noon, Nathan and Emily pulled into the driveway. Nathan carried a bakery box while Emily walked in holding a bouquet of flowers for Margaret. They embraced warmly in the front hallway, laughing about traffic and joking about how impossible it had become to find decent parking downtown on weekends. Everything looked exactly as it had during dozens of family dinners before. That normal appearance made what I already knew feel even heavier. We gathered around the dining table, shared stories about Lily's school projects, discussed the upcoming holidays, and even laughed when Nathan remembered an old camping trip where I accidentally burned breakfast over the campfire. I smiled with everyone else because those memories were real. Whatever secrets had grown inside this family, they had not erased every good moment that came before them. When dinner ended, I stood up quietly and carried a small leather folder from my study back to the table. Margaret looked at me with mild curiosity. Nathan continued pouring coffee, while Emily reached for another slice of pie. None of them appeared nervous. Before we finished dessert, I said calmly, "There is something I would like us to discuss as a family." Nathan smiled. "Sure, Dad. What is on your mind?" I placed the folder on the table without opening it. About 2 weeks ago, I realized there were parts of our financial life that I did not fully understand. So I started asking questions. Margaret's smile faded almost imperceptibly. Emily lowered her coffee cup without taking a sip. Nathan looked from one face to another, obviously confused. I continued speaking in the same calm voice. I met with Richard Benson. I reviewed our bank records. I also met with an attorney. No one interrupted me. The silence around the table became almost tangible. I slowly removed several copies of bank statements and placed them neatly beside the folder. Then I laid down copies of financial documents bearing signatures that did not match the way I had signed my name for decades. Richard believed I had approved these changes, I said. I had not. Margaret stared at the papers without touching them. Emily remained perfectly still. Nathan leaned forward and frowned. "Dad, what are these?" I turned toward my son first because he deserved honesty before accusation. That is exactly what I have been trying to understand. Nathan picked up one page, studied it briefly, then looked toward his mother. "Mom." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she lowered her eyes and folded her hands together. Emily finally spoke in a careful voice. "Maybe there has been some misunderstanding." I nodded politely. That was my first thought as well, which is why I spent several days making sure I only relied on facts. I reached into the folder once more and removed a written timeline prepared with Michael's help. It listed dates, electronic transfers, meetings, and document submissions in chronological order. No opinions. No accusations. Only verified records. Nathan read the first page slowly. The color gradually disappeared from his face. "Mom, why were there meetings without Dad?" he asked quietly. Margaret closed her eyes for a long moment before answering. "Because I thought I could fix everything before he ever found out." Her voice trembled for the first time. Nathan looked even more confused. "Fix? What?" She inhaled deeply before speaking again. "Some investments failed last year." I panicked. I moved money hoping I could recover the losses before Daniel noticed. Emily knew because I asked her to help me understand online banking. I kept telling myself I would put everything back. Emily nodded with tears gathering in her eyes. I should have convinced her to tell you immediately. Instead, I kept believing we could solve it quietly. Nathan slowly set the papers back onto the table and looked at me with genuine disbelief. "Dad, I swear I did not know any of this." I studied his face carefully. For the first time in days, I saw no calculation, no rehearsed expression, only shock and disappointment. In that moment, I realized the truth had divided my family in ways none of us had fully understood. The secrets had finally been spoken aloud, but the hardest decisions were only beginning. No one spoke for what felt like several minutes. The clock on the dining room wall continued its steady rhythm, while the apple pie cooled untouched in the center of the table. I looked at the faces around me and realized that the greatest loss was not the money sitting inside those statements. It was the trust that had quietly disappeared long before anyone admitted the truth. Margaret finally lifted her eyes toward me. They were filled not with excuses, but with exhaustion. "I never wanted to hurt you, Daniel," she whispered. "The first investment was supposed to help us. Someone convinced me it was safe. When it failed, I became terrified. Every decision after that was made because I thought I could repair the previous mistake before you ever discovered it. Instead, I only made everything worse." I listened without interrupting. Months earlier, I probably would have reached across the table and told her we would solve everything together. That version of me no longer existed. Not because I had stopped caring, but because trust cannot survive if honesty arrives only after every other option has disappeared. Nathan looked at his mother with tears in his eyes. "You should have called me. You should have called Dad. We would have figured something out together." Margaret lowered her head. I was ashamed. Emily quietly wiped her eyes. I kept telling myself that protecting the family meant keeping the secret. I understand now that secrets do not protect families. They slowly separate them. Her words lingered in the silence because every person at that table knew they were true. I closed the leather folder and placed both hands on it. "I have already spoken with my attorney," I said calmly. "The remaining accounts have been secured. The missing funds will be addressed through the proper financial process. I am not interested in punishment. I am interested in honesty." Nathan looked relieved to hear those words, but I continued before anyone could misunderstand my meaning. That does not mean life returns to normal tomorrow. Trust has to be rebuilt the same way it was originally created, one honest decision at a time. Margaret nodded slowly, accepting those words without argument. It was the first time in many months that I believed she was no longer trying to control the outcome of the conversation. She simply accepted responsibility for her choices. During the following weeks, our lives changed in quiet but important ways. Margaret began working directly with Richard Benson and Michael Brooks to correct every financial record that could legally be corrected. Emily cooperated fully and provided every document she had access to without hesitation. Nathan attended every meeting because he wanted complete transparency, even when the conversations became uncomfortable. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. As for me, I started doing something I had not done in years. I stopped living on automatic routine. I reviewed every financial statement myself. I asked questions whenever I did not understand something. More importantly, I learned that trust is not the absence of questions. Healthy trust welcomes them because honesty has nothing to fear from clarity. Several months later, I found myself sitting alone on the back porch one cool evening, watching the sun disappear behind the maple trees. Margaret joined me carrying 2 cups of coffee. She sat beside me without speaking for a long time. The silence between us felt different. Now, it was no longer built on hidden truths. It was built on the difficult work of beginning again. Whether our marriage would ever become what it once had been, neither of us knew. Some things can be repaired completely. Others leave quiet reminders that remain forever. I accepted that reality without bitterness. Looking back, I often think about that ordinary afternoon when I returned home expecting nothing more than lunch with the woman I loved. I believed that day had destroyed everything. I understand now that it destroyed an illusion. The truth, painful as it was, gave every member of my family the chance to stop pretending and finally face one another with honesty. Sometimes the hardest conversation of your life is also the first honest step toward peace. And I have learned that peace built on truth will always last longer than comfort built on silence.